We're going to continue our study this morning in our Scriptural Smorgasbord that we've been going through this quarter. We're going to look this morning at Deuteronomy chapter 24, if you'd like to actually turn there. Deuteronomy chapter 24. While you're turning there, and before we really get started, I came across an article I just thought would be fun to share with you, a little thought-provoking thing I saw in the news. It says, "Church without God, how secular congregations fill a need for some non-religious Americans." Think about this. Here we go. It says, shared testimonies, collective singing, silent meditation, and baptism rituals. These are all activities you might find at a Christian church service on a Sunday morning in the United States. But what would it look like if atheists were gathering to do these rituals instead? Today, almost 30% of adults in the U.S. say they have no religious affiliation, and only half attend worship services regularly. But not all forms of church are on the decline, including secular congregations, or what some call atheist churches. Secular congregations often mimic religious organizations by using the language and structure of a church, such as meeting on Sundays, hearing testimonies, adapting religious language or practices in other ways. These secular congregations appeal to atheists and other secular people. There has been a recent rise in secular congregations that explicitly mimic religious organizations and rituals to celebrate atheistic worldviews. So if you are a non-religious person or an atheist, you can come together now in an atheist church. Isn't that nice? Many features of atheist churches in the U.S. are directly borrowed from regular religion. At Sunday Assembly, which is the name of one of those churches, services include singing, reading inspirational texts, silent reflection, and collecting donations, of course. They center around a central lecture given by a member of the congregation or a member of the local community, which would replace a sermon. I attended, the author says, one of the services where an astronomer gave a talk about the New Horizons spacecraft mission to Pluto, and that was the message, the sermon. Another service, a member of a local community garden organization, talked about building community through a community garden program, and that was the sermon. Atheist church organizers I met told me that they intentionally borrow the structure of a church because they see it as a good model for building effective rituals and communities. More generally, the structure of a congregation is popular and familiar to most attendees. The difference, of course, between an atheist church and a regular church is a complete lack of reference to the supernatural, which makes sense because they don't believe in the supernatural. Lectures and rituals at atheist churches are centered around affirming atheistic beliefs, celebrating science, cultivating experiences of awe and wonder for nature, and creating community support. Atheist churches are an example of how non-religious Americans are finding new ways to meet the needs of community of their members. In other words, so many people don't go to church anymore. They say, I seem to have a lack of community and attachment to my people, but I don't believe in God, so what do? I know, we'll create a church for non-believing people, and it fills that need. They say, a member of the church told me, he said, I honestly can't think of a word to describe it. I mean, life-changing sounds silly, but Sunday Assembly, the atheistic church, just helped me so much. I've always struggled with depression, and I'm so much happier now that I have this group of friends who share my belief and are trying to do good out in the world with me. And they get this sense of community in a church that has no God. Last paragraph. Atheist churches are still fairly new, but studies have shown that participation in them and other types of atheist organizations can bring social and emotional benefits. Whether the atheist church trend will continue remains to be seen, but churches' recent growth is evident that they can work much like religious organizations to build community, cultivate ritual, and bolster well-being in a time of religious change. So they say religious organization and belief in God is on the decline in America, but what is on the increase? Atheist churches, and they're replacing the Christian churches. What do you think about that? I mean, ponder that for a minute. I mean, our natural instinct, of course, and I agree, is to say, oh, what a shame, that's horrible where our culture is going. But let's think a little bit more than that. What does that tell us, or what does that imply? What does that bring to us? Why are the people going to church, and what do they see the function of church as being primarily? These atheist people. It's an organization that can bring about a sense of community, a sense of connection, and social change out in the world. And so they say, aha, we don't need God to fulfill the role of a church because we can do that without God. And we can create I don't know if you call it a fake church, but a mimic church, a non-God church, a non-religious church, and we can still accomplish all the functions of a church, but we don't need to have the religion with it, and we can do good, and we can be connected, and we can give people a sense of belonging and a sense of ritual and a sense of stability in their lives, but we don't need God to do it. What do you think about that? I would submit that as bleak as we might say this report is, I think that maybe it's bleaker than the report mentions, because I would almost suggest that a lot of Christian churches have the same mindset. A lot of them go to church, and a lot of them exist because it creates a sense of community outreach, a sense of belonging for its members, a way for people to keep in touch and intact, and to be the member of a group or organization that they can relate to. And like I said, unfortunately, I suspect that there are a lot of Christian churches in our nation who operate in the same way for the same reason as the atheist churches do. That's the concerning part of this to me. And I think they kind of give away their secret here in this last sentence that I just read here. The church's recent growth is evidence that they can work much like religious organizations to build community, cultivate rituals, and bolster well-being in a time of religious change. And if that is the function of a church, then they're absolutely right. My problem with it is I don't think that's the function of a church. What is the function of a church? Or religion in general, or belief in God in general? What is the function of that? It is to give people God's message of salvation, to tell them that they are sinners, that there's a way of salvation for them, that they can have eternal life, that they can have a relationship with God, and that's something that somehow I don't think atheist churches are going to accomplish because they don't believe in God. So they can recreate and mimic all of the social function of a church, and they can do it very well probably. And like I said, probably a lot of Christian churches do the same thing. That's why they're entertainment focused and outreach focused. And outreach is good. I'm not downplaying outreach, but if that's, by outreach we mean feeding the poor and stuff like that, which again is a good thing, and then we should be involved in that. But if that's as far as it goes, as putting food in people's tummies and keeping them warm and giving them stuff, I think they fall a little bit short of the purpose of a genuine church, because a genuine church is a group of believers who support each other in following God and loving Him and submitting to His rules and His laws and loving Him and having Him love us, and that relationship with God. And that's something that the atheist churches, and again, sadly, probably a lot of Christian churches in our country today cannot really comprehend or mimic. So, there we go. I just thought I'd share that with you today. Something for you to think about for the next 5 seconds, because in 5 seconds we're going to start with our real lesson, then you should think about that. We are in Deuteronomy chapter 24 today, laying down God's law. And the story I just read is kind of a good introduction to that, because the atheist churches and too many social churches in our country don't really focus on this much. They are kind of a do what you want and we'll get together and have fun organization. But laying down the law, specifically God's law, and we're going to look in Deuteronomy chapter 24 this week. We could go anywhere throughout the law and do the same thing, but I picked what I thought were kind of some fun and maybe more obscure laws that we don't hear about as often, so we want to go through those this morning. Last week we talked a little bit about the law too, didn't we, in relation to narrative stories. If you can remember clear back to last week, we had somebody who I see was brave enough to come back this week come up front here, and we had a little discussion about, what was that again? Oh yes, sugar, yeah. And we had a sweet treat option for this individual. One was a can of Pepsi, and one was a bowl of sugar, yeah. And we gave the option, which would you rather have, the bowl of sugar or the can of pop? And they chose the can of pop, and we kind of had a discussion. Why? Well, because the sugar, that's like too much. I'm going to be bouncing off the ceiling if I consume all that sugar, so I'll have the pop instead. And then we said, you know, in reality, I weighed it carefully out at home. The bowl of sugar actually has less sugar in it than the can of pop does, and yet you chose the pop because it had less sugar. how does that happen? And we said, well, it's because the sugar in the bowl is very obvious. It's clear what it is. It's granulized, it's purified, it's crystallized, it's sitting there in the bowl. It is the sugar. Where in the other one, it's dissolved in the Pepsi, and it's given flavor, and it's given color, and you're not really as aware of all the sugar that's in the pop because it's put in a different setting, in a different matrix. And so we kind of use that as an illustration between the law and narrative stories in the Bible. In the law, we said the law is God's truth in concentrated, granulated form. God comes right out and he says, this is what you should do. This is how you should behave. You should not steal. You should not envy. You should not covet. You should worship God at all times. You should give thanks and pray without ceasing. All the different commands that we see throughout the Bible. This is how you should behave. Then we get to the stories. And we said the stories are what? They're not just narrative stories that we see for either entertainment purposes or for historical reference, even though sometimes people call them the historical books, and that rubs me a little bit wrong sometimes because it's not just history. God isn't just doing this so we have a history book of Israel. He's doing it to what? Take the principles and truths that we see given in the law in pure form, dilute it down into real-life situations, much like we run into in our own lives out in the world, and it puts it into that context so we can see how God's truth plays out in real-life situations. So narrative law is God's law placed in real-life settings. And I think that's super, super amazing helpful because, again, sometimes it's hard for us in our minds to translate the pure form law into application in everyday life. And I think that maybe contributes sometimes to a kind of a dichotomy, a little split. We have our Sunday Bible brains, and we have our secular work life and school life and regular social life brains. And sometimes the two don't mesh real well together. You know, we come to church and we hear about God's truth, and we go out in the world and we see the way the world works, and the two don't always seem to line up real well. So we look at narrative stories in the Bible to see messy situations and different ways that God's law can apply or be misapplied sometimes, because not everything that we see in the Bible, not everything everybody does in the stories is good. And so we see it apply that way. Now, we say all that as a review just to say today we're going to talk about the law, and I don't mean to use last week's lesson as a way to minimize or degrade the law, because the law is very important. If we didn't have the law portion of it, the story portion of it would have little to no meaning, would it? I mean, it'd be just entertainment stories, kind of like, unfortunately, a lot of people see the Old Testament stories. The little Noah's Ark with the cutesy animals and the, Joshua walking around Jericho, and we make little VeggieTales stories about it and stuff, and it's cute and fun, but what does it really mean? How does it really affect me in real life? Well, it doesn't, people say, because it's old-time stories, people are different, stuff like that doesn't happen anymore, so it doesn't apply to me. And I say that's not at all true, because even if the situations aren't the same in your life and theirs, the same laws and principles still apply because the same God is still in charge. So today we're actually going to study the law of it, and actually the law itself even has a root even deeper than the law itself. If the stories come from the law, what does the law come from? Does God just arbitrarily pick some stuff to boss people around with and control their lives? And he said, all right, I'm going to say, how about you not do this, and how about you not do that, and the other thing, so that I have a way of reining you in, and that just sounds like a fun idea. Where do the laws come from? Thinking. I think maybe the laws themselves are rooted in who God is to begin with. God's character and his attributes and who he is produces the laws that he gives to the people, and the laws to the people generates the stories that illustrates the laws to the people. So God's law simply reflects God's character, who is the lawgiver. And so it's important for us to study the laws even in the Old Testament, and even though I know the New Testament says the law is now obsolete because we now have the fulfillment of the law and we don't have to live under the law anymore. And I say, yes, that's true. That's absolutely right. Paul said so. So why do we bother studying it? Because we can still see a lot about who God is and his character, and then figure out, again, how to apply that in our lives today. In other words, God might have demonstrated one of his character attributes in one way to the Israelites at that time, and even though that specific application or specific law doesn't apply to us today, the same concept or his character has not changed, and so we figure out how to apply that law to ourselves today. Does that kind of make sense? We figure out who God is by the law that he gives. So we're going to go through chapter 24 and the first little part of chapter 25. If we get that far, we'll just go as far as we have time for. And I want to look at some of these laws, which, again, don't get as much attention because they're kind of quirky, oddball laws, and so I thought they'd just be super fun to go through this morning, make us think a little bit, and why are they here, and what are we supposed to see through them? So Deuteronomy 25 through 25, 4:20, yeah, you got that? Chapter 24, verse 5 through chapter 25, verse 4, miscellaneous laws is the topic that my Bible prints in here. Of course, that's not an inspired caption. That's just when they're putting it together, somebody decided to title this section Miscellaneous Laws. So aside from all the laws about the worship and the justice and the festivals and stuff that we see throughout Deuteronomy and the other books of the law, these laws here are regarding the various details of everyday life. And again, that's not to minimize the others. I just chose this section to go to just because I did. So let's read through some of these, and we'll discuss them a little bit, make you think a little bit, and we'll get a flavor for how to look at God's laws, even the ones that don't directly apply to us in terms of being enforced today. Chapter 24, verse 5. Let's start with this one. Call it the 1-year honeymoon law. All right, here we go. 24 verse 5. When a man is newly married, he shall not go out with the army or be liable for any other public duty. He shall be free at home for 1 year to be happy with his wife, or I have a footnote here that says, or to make his wife happy, whom he has taken. That sounds like a weird oddball law. Why in the world? What is this about? If you go and get married, young man, whoever you are not allowed to serve in the military or go out on any military campaigns or be responsible for any other public duty. You can't be county commissioner or sheriff or where's Randy? What's your title again? County commissioner board thing?
Councilman.
Councilman. You cannot be councilman if you got man. Not a counselor at all, yes, right. Councilman, you can't serve on any public board or any public office, anything like that, if you have gotten married less than 1 year ago. God's law. Thus saith the Lord, you shall not do that. Where does God come up with this weirdo stuff? Obviously, it's not weirdo stuff. God put it in there. So what's the point? What was God trying to teach? If you get married less than 1 year ago, he shall not go out with the army or be liable for any other public duty. It kind of explains itself a little bit in the next sentence, doesn't it? And I wish I could be teaching this lesson upstairs where we could dialogue better. I really do. Here's the point. He shall be free at home 1 year to be happy with his wife or to make his wife happy, depending on how this phrase is translated, whom he has taken. First of all, why 1 year? I had to think about this for a minute, but I think I finally figured it out. Because after 1 year of being together, what would make his wife happy is to see him get out of the house for a while. Go on a military campaign. I don't care. Go to Syria, go to Iraq, go to Babylon, anywhere. Just get out of here. So after 1 year, making his wife happy means getting away for a while. Now, I'm kind of kidding about that, halfway. 1 year. 1 year you have to spend at home. You have to set up your home, set up your family. You establish, your crops and your livelihood and all that stuff, but stay home. And it says here why. It says to make your wife happy and to be happy with your wife for that period of time. So what are we supposed to see about God from this law? What does God value? What does he prioritize? How does he see our lives, and how does he want us to participate in this life that we have? What can we see about God, first of all? What does this demonstrate to us about God? He places a value on marriage and the family, right? That's a big deal to him. He says, once you've established that, you better make sure that's pretty solid before you start endeavoring in even political and national life. He says the foundation starts right there. And so you better make sure that's good and solid and, congealed together and you're attached and all that stuff. And then you can go out, once you've got that under control, go out and do other stuff. So even before the national, even before the military, which, by the way, God organized the Israeli military, and he sent them out on missions, right? Go attack these people, go attack those people, stuff like that in that day. But he said, even more important than that, you stay at home for 1 full year, not a month, not a week, not 6 months, a full year to make sure that is solidified. What else do we see in this? As I read through this, I thought, God could have just said, once you get married, here I discourages divorce and all that stuff, but he could have said, you will stay together as you do your other stuff. But he didn't have to stay together for 1 year free of other obligations. Did you see what his rationale was for there? Look back at your verse. Not just so that you stay together or so that you get the hang of it. It is to make your wife, say the word? Happy. So it's not just supposed to be a begrudging obligation. You're supposed to maybe enjoy things a little bit. Is it okay to enjoy that kind of thing? Being together with somebody, maybe? Yeah, I think maybe it is. So here's what I put together. This law demonstrates the value that God places on marriage and family. He focuses on the happiness to the wife, or your happiness with the wife, again, translation, whatever. But either way, it's the same thing. Happiness to the wife, consideration of others and serving them. You are to stay at home and you are to please your wife. You're to make her happier, to make her enjoy being with you, enjoy the marriage thing, enjoy life. Make her happy. Be considerate of someone else. Serve her or her serve him or whatever, either way. Be conscious and considerate of somebody else's needs and wants. Learn to serve them in that way. And finally, the last part, God endorses the enjoyment of life. There are enough sacrifices, there are enough heartache, there are enough trials, there's enough difficulties, there's enough suffering in life that sometimes I think we're almost tempted to think that there's somehow virtue in being unhappy and miserable. There is not virtue in being unhappy and miserable. Now, sometimes we are called upon and required to suffer for Christ's sake. I mean, that does happen. But being miserable in and of itself is not a virtue that God set up. God did not create the Garden of Eden when all things were perfect to be a miserable, lonely, horrific place where Adam and Eve hated life. God wants us to also be happy and enjoy things. I just read through, I think I said before, in my own reading, in Ecclesiastes. How many times throughout Ecclesiastes does Solomon say, in terms of this life right here, there's nothing better than to, what? To eat, to drink, and enjoy the work that God has given you. Enjoy your life. There's enough problems in this world. You don't need to create more for yourself. So God says, stay at home for a year, solidify that family unit and that marriage, make sure that's solid before we go out and do anything else. But during that year, don't make each other miserable any more than you have to. He says, make each other happy. Enjoy the situation that I've created. And that's just something about God as well. He wants us to enjoy ourselves and be happy in His way, according to His law, according to His character, but He wants us to be happy. What do you think of that law? Pretty good law? Does it make sense? Not so bad, is it? All right, that was the very first one, and we're at 9:23 already. I've got like 10 of these things. But we'll only go as far as we have time for, and you can read the rest at home. That's a good deal. The next one, verse 6 says this. I call it collateral of a loan. Completely shifting gears here to a different topic. No one shall take a mill or an upper millstone in pledge, for that would be taking a life in pledge. First of all, what do we mean by pledge? Pledge is we'll call it collateral in a loan, right? I'm granting you so much money, but to ensure that you pay me back, I will take something of yours so that you are incentivized to pay me back the loan, right? A pledge, a collateral. He says if you are lending somebody money and you are taking some kind of collateral from them, you are not allowed to take one thing of theirs. There's something that's off limits to you to take, and that is not their car, not their bicycle, not their house, their millstone. Millstone. First of all, who even has a millstone? Well, today nobody has millstones because we have Walmart and we have Grandma's Pantry and all these other things. We just hop in the car and go buy bread and come back. Back then, that wasn't the way it worked, of course. You had grain. You'd either raise your grain probably or buy grain or whatever. But nobody wants to sit around and eat dry, cracked corn all day. You want to actually make bread with it. And so to make bread, you have to put it into the mill, right? 2 round stones. Maybe the top one has a handle on it if it's a really small one or whatever. Or maybe it's a little bit bigger if you have a multifamily one or whatever. And and you put the grain in there in the top little hole, and you spin the top stone around, and it grinds on the bottom stone, and those grains kind of go down, and they get squished together between the stones, rubbed out really flat, and out the bottom pops flour, yeah, and then you can make your bread and stuff. And so the law says, if you are taking collateral for a loan, no one shall take a mill, the whole thing, or even just the upper millstone in pledge. Why just an upper one? I have to speculate a little bit here, but probably the upper one was a little bit lighter and more transportable. So just in case somebody says, aha, God says don't take the mill, so I won't take the whole mill, I'll just take the upper piece. Well, what good is a bottom piece if you have no upper piece? It's like saying, I won't take your car, I'll just take all the wheels. Well, what good is having a car if it has no wheels? Okay, you can't use just one millstone. So he says, don't take the whole mill or even just one of the pieces, the upper one, in pledge. Why? What does this teach us about who God is and what he prioritizes in his values? Well, if you are taking their millstone, you're kind of, really what you're doing is depriving them of a way to have a decent meal, a decent diet in their lives. In fact, look at the next phrase here in the end of verse 6. Don't take their millstone, for that would be taking a life in pledge. You are, in a way, you're holding their very lives in pledge. They can't eat and have a decent diet and a decent meal without this thing. And it would be, can we use the term today, cruel and unusual, just as collateral of a loan, for you to take the means of their very eating and their very existence for these people. So even though this is a poor person, and even though they are obligated and indebted to you because you gave them something, you have a boundary as well. You are not to treat them as if you own their entire lives. You have to have respect for them in return. So they have an obligation to you to pay you back, but you have an obligation to them, and that is showing them dignity and respect in the process and not obliterating their lives until they pay you back. Okay? So, what this law does is it demonstrates the value, first of all, that God places on compassion. Now, again, without this law and others like it, I can see all the angry rich Scrooge bankers come along. I demand my pledge. Give me something. Give me my loan. Give me my collateral. I'm going to take the most valuable thing you have until you pay me back every cent. It almost reminds me of the parable that Jesus told about the two debtors. Remember, the king forgave the rich guy, and then the rich guy goes out to the poor guy who also owed him something. And even after the rich guy was forgiven by the king, the rich guy goes to the poor guy and says, I'm going to throw you in prison until you pay back every cent. And again, the irony there is, if you're in prison, you're not making any money, how do you ever pay the guy back if you're in prison, so you can't earn the money to pay back to get out of prison? Cruel and unusual. It's not reasonable. It's showing no dignity to the other person. So this law demonstrates the value that God places on compassion and dignity for other people, consideration for them. It emphasizes mercy to the poor, consideration of the debtor's livelihood. And even though they are poor and even though they need a loan for whatever reason, they still have their basic human dignity. You are to respect and care for and show love and compassion towards that person. It prioritizes the people over the prosperity. Now, is not the whole point of a pledge to incentivize somebody to repay that loan? Yes. What better way to give incentive than to take their most valuable, necessary possession, right? Yes. So financially, taking their millstone makes perfect sense because they are going to be super motivated to pay you back so they get that thing back. But God says, no, there's more important things even than just getting your money back. That is showing care and compassion for the other people, prioritization of people over prosperity. And so God says, as a way of showing that and symbolizing that, you are not allowed to go and take somebody's millstone as collateral for their loan. And every time somebody comes to the house to collect a collateral, they're supposed to look at that millstone and say, I'm not allowed to take that, because that would be degrading and dehumanizing, would you call it even, to the person. And I'm not allowed to do that, because God's not that way. How's that law? Pretty good? God's not so dumb after all, is he? Let's go to the next one. This is a tough one. Verse 7. If a man is found stealing one of his brothers of the people of Israel, and if he treats him as a slave or sells him, then that thief shall die. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. What is going on here? Two Israelites, two Jewish people living in the times back then. One says, aha, I know how to make a few extra bucks, so I'm going to kidnap my neighbor guy or gal or whatever it is, and I'm going to either make them my slave, I'm going to kidnap them, either make them my slave, or what else does it say? Sell them as a slave or some other function. I'm going to kidnap my fellow brethren and either keep them for my own personal advantage as a slave or sell them off. Today we call that what? Human trafficking, right. And I'm going to sell them off so that I make money and they will go off and be a slave or do whatever. I don't care what they do because I have my money. God says, should be obvious, but let's make a law about this. You are not allowed to do that. And if you are found stealing one of your brothers of the people of Israel, treat them like a slave or sell them, that thief shall die. This is a capital offense, God says. You will die for doing this because this is pretty egregious. This is pretty bad. And the reason he shall die is the last phrase. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. Again, this one we relate to a little bit more because we know full well what human trafficking is today. Our world still deals with this. We know what slavery is because at least our nation from its past is still suffering the consequences in many ways from this. But God says, you will not do this. This is against my law. This is not who I am. This does not reflect my character. I think it's kind of self-explanatory in terms of why. I mean, this demonstrates God's love and recognition of all people. One person does not have the right over another person to say, I am of somehow higher value than you. You are property, I am people, so I'm going to sell you as property. Now, it's, in all fairness and all full disclosure, he does say, of the people of Israel. God did allow the Israelites to enslave other people whom they were conquering. And we can get into that another time or after service or whatever if you want to discuss that. But he says, of the other people of Israel. Among your own people, you as a nation are to demonstrate what I'm like to other nations. You are to be my example, and within yourselves, you are to demonstrate my character to the rest of the world, and you are to treat each other with respect, and you are not allowed to sell each other as slaves or have slaves of each other. That's not how it works. I care for all of you, I love all of you have dignity, and you're not allowed to treat each other that way. So this demonstrates God's love and recognition of all people. Respect and compassion for others is how we are supposed to behave. He says, the thief shall die, and so eliminate the evil. And God was so serious and so sincere and adamant about this. This is, in our passage, there are many others with us, but in our passage, this is the only capital punishment sin, this one right here. And again, there are many, many, many other capital punishment crimes throughout the law. I'm not saying this is the only one. But in this one, this is the one that is a capital crime. Because you're not allowed to treat people and see other people in that way. You're supposed to treat them as equals and with that dignity and care and respect. All right. A few more. How about this one? Contagious diseases. Verse 8, take care in the case of leprous disease to be very careful to do according to all that the Levitical priest shall direct you. As I commanded them, so you shall be careful to do. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the way as you came out of Egypt. This law is interesting to me for a couple reasons. One, he doesn't really give the law of what to do in this passage. He had already covered that pretty thoroughly back in the book of Leviticus, and there's a lengthy portion there of what to do if you have some kind of skin contagious disease. You go to the priest, and the priest evaluates you, and you're to go do this for so long and come back to the priest, and depending on what he sees, you're supposed to either wash off or go away for longer and come back to the priest, and it's a whole big, long, involved process. And so in this passage here, he doesn't repeat all that. He just refers back to Leviticus. And in fact, in this passage, the emphasis isn't even really on what you do. What is the emphasis on in this passage? Take care, in case of leprous disease, to be very careful to do all the stuff that the Levitical priest shall direct you. As I commanded them, so you shall be careful to do. Really, the disease is almost just kind of an instance of the main point. What is the main point in this passage? You are to obey and follow what the priest tells you in this specific case, and all others, of course, do. But he says, remember what I said back there? When you're to go to the priest and you're supposed to listen to them, you make sure that you do what they tell you to do. Whatever I've told them to do, they're going to relay to you, and you make sure that you do what they tell you to do. Then he says, remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the way as you came out of Egypt. Does everybody remember that story? Quickie recap, right? They're traveling along. Aaron and Miriam kind of get tired of Moses. He married a Cushite woman. They didn't like that. They said, well, are you the only one that God speaks to? Can't God speak to any of us? And so they kind of rebelled a little bit against Moses, their brother. Moses, a very humble man, God says, and so God came down and fought Moses. He defended Moses for him. He stepped between them and says, hey Miriam, hey Aaron, when I talk to Moses, I speak to him face to face like a man speaks to his friend. Why are you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And God leaves and goes away. But when he leaves and goes away, everybody looks at Miriam, and Miriam is stricken with this leprosy, this disease. And she realizes, obviously, instantly, first of all, I've way crossed the line and God is judging me. But second of all, she's now gone from a high-up leader. Now she is in the lowest of the low because she's a leper. She's got to go outside the camp for 7 days, and then she has to come back in and follow whatever the priest says. She has to submit to the priest, again, follow his orders, and then do whatever he says, and presumably she was, healed then at that point. But she had to, again, be humbled because of this leprosy and follow what the priest said. So what's the point of this verse here? Why did God put this in here? What does this tell us about who God is or what he's trying to communicate to us? Well, it talks about he's demonstrating his desire for obedience and orderliness. Again, the emphasis here is not so much on the disease itself. He covered that in Leviticus. The emphasis here is following what the priest says. God says, I have set up a system, and even though this situation in particular will be kind of long, painful, uncomfortable, weird, nobody wanted to be the leper. They had to go and be ostracized outside the camp for 3 or 7 or 10 or however many days. Nobody wanted to be that person because it's no fun, and it's difficult, and it's inconvenient, and it's embarrassing, and nobody wants to do it. And so you go to the priest, and the priest says, sorry, you've got this disease. You have to go outside the camp, away from community, away from family, away from all of everything, and live among this area that we've designated for lepers for an unspecified period of time. And it's going to be no fun, and you're going to hate it. And I can only imagine my initial thought, that is, what? I don't really want to do this. There's got to be another way. Maybe I'll just sleep in the spare bedroom for a while so I don't have to go all the way out there and be uncomfortable and be ostracized and be weird for a while because I don't want to do that. I'm going to just kind of social distance for a while instead of going outside the camp, and I'll be just fine. And so God says, no, I don't think so. He says, I have set up a system. I have given you people, I've given you, general people, public, a system set up that you are to follow. You're to go to the priest. The priests are relaying my message to them. You are to follow what they say, and you're supposed to obey the law in that fashion. So, be very careful to do all according to the Levitical priest shall direct you. As I command them, so you shall be careful to do. Remember what I did to Miriam. Miriam didn't like my system that I set up. She didn't like having Moses being the leader and they were subordinate to him. She rebelled, and I had to set her straight with a bout of leprosy. Now, if you're set straight with a bout of leprosy, don't buck the same system that I gave you. Follow the procedure, right? And so what he's showing that God is a God of obedience and a God of orderliness. We're not to make our own laws. We're not to make our own way. If God set up a system, we are to follow it. He knows what's best. Submission to and respect of authority is what God is getting at. Remember Miriam, he says. Don't be like Miriam in that situation. Do what I tell you to do. One more. Collateral. Another collateral. We've seen a collateral before, haven't we? In fact, I gave it the exact same title because they're kind of similar here. Verses, I can't even read what that's out, 10 through 13. Here it goes. When you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to collect his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. Let's pause right there for a second, because this is kind of in two parts. So you make a loan to somebody, you go to their house to collect the collateral. First of all, you know one thing already. When you go there, one piece of collateral you cannot collect is millstone. That's off limits. Cannot take the millstone. Something else you're going to collect. So you go to his house, and you say, I'm going to make sure that he knows that I'm in charge, and that he's, put a little bit of fear into him, or remind him that he has to pay this back. And so I'm going to barge into his house, throw open his door, demand that he give me something, grab whatever it is that I want, as long as it's not the millstone. I will grab what I want, and I will march out. And he will know that I am watching him, and he's going to pay me back, or else. How does that situation strike you? Maybe not so well. I'm sorry? Oppressive. Yeah, that's a good word. Thank you. Oppressive. Yeah. And again, you're treating your fellow Israelite brother with less than respect, less than dignity. So God puts this weirdo law into his law. He says, when you go to your neighbor, a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to collect a pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. You're not allowed to bust down the door. You're not allowed to barge into his house. That is his domain. That's his area. Show some respect for himself, for the family, for everybody else. They're probably already not super proud about having to take out a loan in the first place. That's probably already humiliating enough for them. But to have you barge in and say, I will take what I want, this is mine until you pay me back, that is oppressive. I like the word. It's undignified. So you need to stand outside on the sidewalk and let him know that you're there. He knows, hey, I'm here, whatever. And then he will take whatever it is. He will bring it out and offer it to you. Much more respectful, much more civilized. He continues in verse 12. If he's a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. What? We'll continue on. It explains. You shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets, so that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you. Apparently at that time, again for poor people who are the ones that would be needing this loan in the first place, they don't have a whole lot to give for collateral. The millstone is already off limits. What else do you have to take? Probably the easiest thing is their coat, their robe, their cloak, right? And so you take this overcoat that they have as a collateral, so they'll pay you back. But he says, when you do this, verse 12, if he's a poor man and doesn't have anything else, you're obviously going to take his clothes, or his outer coat. You shall not sleep in his pledge. So the rich guy takes the cloak back to his house as collateral. He says, oh, look, now I have an extra blanket because the outer cloak doubles as a blanket at night. He says, oh, look, now I have 2 blankets. Poor guy over there, unfortunately, has none, but, he's a poor guy, and this is collateral, and that's just the way the ball bounces. He says, do not do that. He says, you shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you. Every night, you, the rich guy, have to walk back to the poor guy's house, say, here, the sun's going down, it's getting chilly, why don't you take this back for the night? In the morning, when it's a little bit warmer, I'll come back for it, and I'll take it back again. Whew. And so the poor guy gets it, he's warm all night, he gets up in the morning, sun comes up, takes it back to the other guy, who is not allowed to come into his house and retrieve it. He has to take it out to him. Sounds like a lot of hassle, doesn't it? Again, I think it's kind of self-explanatory, but what's the point here? Dignity and concern and respect for the fellow Israelite, and mercy as well. Now, legally, the guy owes you money, and you can take pledge. That's the whole point for collateral. but having compassion at the same time and balancing that out, saying, I know you're going to be freezing all night long. That's not right. So I will give this back to you at night. In the morning, I'll come and take it again until the loan is paid, but I don't want you to freeze in the meantime. Same basic concept as the millstone. We don't want you to starve. We don't want you to freeze. Two things. So that's what this law demonstrates. Demonstrates God's love and expectation of mutual respect of others. Talks about his compassion and consideration of others. And the last phrase there is, and it, this action, this behavior, shall be righteousness for you before the Lord your God. There's not a whole lot of things that God says, this will be righteousness for you. His faith is counted for righteousness. There's a few other things. But God says, when you behave in this way, you're demonstrating my character. You're showing love towards other people. You're being who I want you to be. This will be a righteousness for you if you do this thing, because you're behaving exactly the way that I would behave, God says. Compassion on other people, prioritizing their well-being even over your own financial security, maybe, and just having love for other people. And that reflects who God is and his character. Good news is I have about 6 more of these things we can go through. The bad news is it's already time to quit. And so you can go home, you can read through chapter 25, verse 4 on your own. Think about each one of those commands that you see, how it reflects who God is, why he put that in there, and I don't have to tell you then, because you don't need me at all. All right, let's pray and we'll dismiss. Dear God, we thank you this morning for this time we can look through your law. We can spend a little bit more time this morning instead of just kind of glancing through and breezing over these laws and saying, oh, that was weird, that was a different time and place, how bizarre. We can see maybe a little bit of why you put these things into your word. Why would you command your people to do these things? And we realize it's because it's a reflection of who you are in your law. We are to behave as you would behave, and these are ways that you can demonstrate to us how you behave. We can learn about who you are by the law that you give. We thank you for giving us all these things and letting us learn from them. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.